Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, here to help you fall asleep with these chilling horror stories. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is, so feel free to leave a comment. When you're ready, get comfortable and relax. It all started. I was about 13 years old when it all went down. Back then, I was a shy, awkward kid, the kind who quickly became the target of ridicule and cruelty in our small West Texas town. Old superstitions and eerie legends were a regular part of conversation here, and I seemed to be the perfect victim. For years, almost everyone in town tormented me. It was the start of a new school year, and before long, I found myself at the mercy of Billy and his gang, Ricky and Travis always trailing behind him. That day, things went further than ever before. They trashed my notebooks and pencils outside of school and beat me up in broad daylight on the dusty main street. I told my parents, teachers, and even the principal about what happened, but the school did little to intervene. Billy and his cronies were just sent to the principal's office and given a warning, far from enough to end the relentless torment. I cried a lot that day, and the anger inside me burned fiercely. I yearned for revenge, desperate for a way to make them suffer as I had. Yet, I was too scared to stand up for myself, knowing full well what might happen if anyone ever learned it was me. With hardly any friends to rely on, I confided in my parents about everything. They were understanding, but there wasn't much they could do to shield me from the daily abuse. It was my only solace in a world that felt increasingly hostile. In our town, there was an old man named Jed who often tried to chat with me. My folks always warned me that he was a strange character, someone surrounded by unsettling rumors and dark tales. Naturally, I steered clear of him at first. One sweltering evening, as the sun dipped low behind the mesquite trees and the red dirt roads shimmered in the heat, I was walking home after another grueling day at school, a day full of humiliation and cruelty, when I ran into Jed. By then, he'd moved into the rundown house right next door, its sagging porch and creaking boards a fixture of the neighborhood. He called out to me twice in his gravelly voice, and for once I couldn't resist the pull. Instead of bolting away like usual, I hesitantly stepped toward him. He asked me how school was going and mentioned that he'd once been a friend of my granddaddy. We settled onto a rickety wooden chair on his porch, the sound of cicadas filling the heavy air as we talked. Jed spun incredible yarns about his past, stories of riding out fierce dust storms, nearly being struck by lightning while hauling cattle in a sudden violent storm, and even tales of a narrow escape from a rattlesnake pit near an abandoned oil field. I listened, wide-eyed, longing to be as brave and wild as he. In my heart, I thought that if I could muster even a fraction of his daring, maybe I'd finally be seen as cool, and the bullies would leave me alone. But no matter how hard I tried to avoid Billy and his gang, their cruelty only escalated. They began orchestrating more dangerous pranks, hurling sharp objects, like a pair of scissors, right in my direction. One afternoon during recess, while I was scribbling away on my homework, Billy snatched my notebook and waved it in front of me as I desperately tried to reclaim it. Two of his pals held me down while he tore the notebook to shreds and dumped the fragments into a nearby trash bin. Laughter erupted from the gathered kids. Both boys and girls joined in. In that moment, a burning desire for justice overtook me. On my way home that day, I encountered Jed again. He beckoned me over with a crooked smile and led me into his creaking house, a place filled with relics of a bygone era. Dusty oil lamps, faded photographs of a younger Jed in a leather jacket, and old vinyl records playing soft country tunes. Almost immediately, I sensed a strange, almost electric tension in the air. A feeling that the kindly old man I thought I knew was wearing a different face tonight. "What you got on your mind, kid? You look downright miserable," Jed asked, his tone uncharacteristically grave. Hesitantly, I began recounting the events of the day, the endless humiliations and the unbearable torment inflicted by Billy and his pals. Jed listened in eerie silence until I finished. Then his face darkened, and his voice dropped to a menacing whisper. "Do you want revenge? Do you want them to stop?" "Yeah, I want them to stop. I want them to suffer just like I have," I replied, my voice shaking with raw fury. "I'll set things in motion for you," he said, a sinister glint dancing in his eyes. "But you gotta do something for me in return." "What do you mean?" I asked, trembling. "I'll tell you when the time's right. For now, just trust me and agree," Jed replied with a cryptic smile. Even though something about him sent a chill down my spine, I hesitantly agreed. "Okay." "Then it's settled. They'll get what's coming to them," he declared, in a voice that echoed like a deep, far-off rumble over the barren plains. But the unsettling aura emanating from Jed made me uneasy. I told him I didn't feel right and bolted out of his house as fast as I could. That encounter haunted me for a long time. I couldn't shake the image of that dark, shifting expression on his face. After that, I deliberately avoided him, even when he tried to call out to me. It wasn't long before my parents found out about his visits. My dad was livid. He scolded me for weeks and forbade me from ever associating with that old-timer again. I'd hear him bellowing at Jed through our thin walls, and slowly, I began to understand why the townsfolk kept their distance from him. Not long after, strange things started happening at school. Billy and his gang began skipping class more frequently, and when they did show up, they sat unusually quiet, almost as if they had been changed overnight. It was odd, because I knew these boys were notorious for stirring up trouble. I couldn't understand what had happened, and I was relieved to see the bullying finally taper off. But I had no inkling that the real nightmare was just beginning. In the days that followed, Billy and his friends fell ill repeatedly. Headaches, stomach aches, and a persistent pain in their chests that kept them confined at home. Their parents grew increasingly worried, and soon whispers started spreading around town. Had Jed's dark powers cursed them? The very thought made me smile bitterly, but it also filled me with dread, for I knew I still owed him a debt. For a week or so, nothing else happened. Whenever I saw Jed, I purposely averted my eyes, even when he tried to wave me over from his sagging porch. But after about 2 weeks of no contact, the unthinkable occurred. Jed was arrested for harassing another child. At last, I understood why my folks had warned me to steer clear of him. At first, I felt relieved that he was behind bars, thinking he could no longer hurt me. But soon after, strange accidents began plaguing Billy and his crew. Mysterious forces knocked them off balance when they climbed trees or rode their bikes along the cracked pavement of our town, and hushed whispers about shadowy figures and uncanny presences became the talk of the local diner. Some dismissed the stories as mere rumors, but many were convinced that Billy and his pals were cursed, a fitting retribution for all the torment they had inflicted on me. Even though I was glad the bullying had subsided, Jed's sinister presence continued to linger in my mind. Every now and then, I'd feel as though something unworldly was watching me from the edge of the cornfields. I often wondered what might have happened if he hadn't been taken away. The mere thought sent shivers down my spine. Then, a shocking rumor spread through town. Clint, one of Billy's closest friends and the best swimmer at our school, had drowned in the nearby dusty lake. They said an unknown force had dragged him under the water, as if a ghostly hand had pulled him away while he desperately cried for help. A deep sense of foreboding gripped me whenever I thought of it. Had my deal with Jed unleashed something terrible upon us all? I spent hours that night lost in dark thoughts. As I barely drifted off to sleep, a monstrous shadow invaded my dreams. A vague, terrifying silhouette that I can now only remember in fragments. Not long after, I was startled awake by a knock at my door. It was midnight, and while everyone else in the house slept soundly, I crept to the door to see who it might be. When I opened it, there was no one, just the silent, stifling night. I combed through the yard beneath the glow of a lone street lamp, but found nothing. No sooner had I closed the door did the knocking resume. This time, mustering all my courage, I checked again. But again, there was no one there. Those eerie events stole my sleep that night, and the following day I suffered severe headaches that kept me home from school. I recounted every unsettling detail to my mother, the midnight knocks, the haunting dream, but she dismissed it as an overactive imagination. Yet, deep inside, I knew something was terribly wrong. One fateful night when I was home alone because my parents had gone to tend to my sick grandmother, the knocking grew louder and more insistent. It was well past 3 a.m., and I trembled with fear, too scared to open the door. I lay frozen, paralyzed by terror, as the relentless knocks echoed through the silent house until they suddenly stopped. With a pounding heart, I finally mustered the courage to open the door, only to find nothing there. Barely settling back into bed, I heard a soft, unnerving whisper calling my name, a voice so deep and unnatural that it sent chills racing down my spine. I peered into the dark hallway from which it seemed to emanate, but saw nothing. The night passed in a haze of mounting fear and restless unease. The next day, I skipped school again because of my ongoing headaches. A few days later, when I found sleep equally elusive, the knocking at the door became even more persistent. This time, even my parents were awake, though they slept as if nothing were amiss. In desperation, I roused my father. "Dad, wake up! Someone's knocking at the door." He listened for a moment and in his gruff Texan tone replied, "I ain't hearing nothing." But the knocking persisted, trapping me in a cycle of terror. Eventually, the noise became so unbearable that I had to step outside to get a drink of water. As I sipped from a chipped mug on the back porch, I noticed a dark figure lurking behind an old mesquite tree. One massive, eerie eye glinted from the shadow, while the rest of its face melted into darkness. I instantly knew that what I saw wasn't human. Startled and nearly choking on my water, I bolted back inside. In the nights that followed, the terror only worsened. I blacked out repeatedly, waking up in the middle of the vast, open brush, with no memory of how I got there. Thankfully, the wilderness wasn't too far from home, so I managed to find my way back, though each journey left me more shaken. My parents grew increasingly worried, and finally I told them everything about Jed, the unholy pact I'd made, and the relentless supernatural horrors that had since plagued my nights. That's when my father, his voice low and full of regret, pulled me aside one quiet evening while my mother was out in the kitchen. He revealed the true story of Jed. It turned out that Jed hadn't always been a local. Once, he'd been a well-respected man with everything in order. But everything changed when he met Lila, one of the prettiest girls in town with a heart as big as Texas. He fell hard for her at first sight. Lila, kind and beloved by everyone, from the folks at the church to the regulars at the corner diner, had once been friendly with Jed, but when he proposed to her, she coldly turned him down, insisting that their relationship was purely platonic. Crushed, Jed soon learned that Lila was engaged to a generous, hard-working man named Thomas, who was known around these parts for lending a helping hand to anyone in need. Consumed by jealousy and bitter rage, Jed delved into dark rituals to curse Lila and Thomas, and it seemed his sinister magic had taken hold. Lila suffered 3 miscarriages, and Thomas fell gravely ill time and again. So much so that even the best doctors in the nearest big city were baffled. Before long, everyone in town whispered that they were cursed. Eventually, Lila did become pregnant again, her fourth child. At first, things appeared normal, but shortly after the baby was born, deformed and lifeless, Lila's condition deteriorated rapidly. Thomas continued to fall sick, and Jed's unruly behavior escalated, harassing and even assaulting some of the townsfolk, which ultimately led to his arrest and banishment. Yet, after his release, he reappeared as if drawn back by some dark force. Although this grim tale wasn't exactly child-friendly, my father insisted that I learn the truth about Jed, and he was relieved I hadn't been ensnared by his dark influence back then. But that was only the beginning. The paranormal encounters grew ever more frequent. I kept seeing the same bizarre, unsettling creature, its limbs unnaturally thin and contorted, its single glaring eye burning into my soul. Every time I caught a glimpse of it, I'd black out and find myself in the brush or out near an abandoned farmhouse. The episodes increased until my parents finally called in an exorcist to get to the bottom of it all. One such exorcist, a man named Jake, even stayed with us for a while to assess my condition. During Jake's stay, everything seemed normal at first. He and his team couldn't pinpoint anything wrong with me, or with our creaking old house that had seen better days. But just a few nights after they left, I had a vivid, horrifying dream. I was trapped in an endless white room, and from the far end, that grotesque creature advanced on me. It grinned in a mocking, inhuman way, and spoke in a voice that chilled me to the bone. I remember only fragments of its words. It declared that it would curse Billy and his gang, and that my body was now collateral. I awoke the next morning drenched in sweat. I tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare, but the oppressive dread lingered. From that day on, the blackouts became more frequent, and I'd suddenly find myself in places I couldn't recall traveling to. By the time I turned 16, I was nearly confined to my room, shunned by nearly everyone due to inexplicable, violent outbursts I couldn't remember. My parents had enlisted exorcists for years, yet nothing could banish the dark presence that had taken root in me. One night, not long after midnight, I heard a deafening crash outside, like a motorcycle colliding with something solid. Screams pierced the still night, and I knew something terrible had happened. Once the noise died down, I overheard my parents speaking in hushed, worried tones about Billy. The next morning, another exorcist entered my room and performed strange, arcane gestures that sent me into yet another blackout. Then he delivered the most unnerving revelation. When he asked if anything unusual had happened with Jed, I recalled that eerie encounter on that fateful day, the one that carried an unmistakable cursed aura. The exorcist explained that it wasn't truly Jed who had spoken to me, but rather a vengeful spirit, a malevolent force that thrives on negative emotions. Once someone strikes a bargain with it, the spirit takes over the victim's body, and the nightly blackouts will persist until the spirit finds another host. Likewise, the curse I had unwittingly laid upon Billy and his cronies would haunt them until their dying day. Those words struck me like a lightning bolt. My parents were beside themselves with worry. Not long before, Billy had been in a serious accident, injuries so severe that one of his legs had to be amputated in a city hospital. Rumor had it that this was the direct result of the curse I'd unleashed. Now, at 32 years old, I find myself unable to lead a normal life. The possession and the unholy pact with that vengeful spirit, a supernatural force born from pure malice, have robbed me of any hope for a proper future. My parents still confine me to my room, and I only open the door when absolutely necessary. To this day, I live with the crushing regret of the deal I made with Jed on that fateful night. This is my story, a true account of how a desperate thirst for revenge spiraled into a nightmare I could never escape. A dark chapter set against the rugged, unforgiving backdrop of Texas. As a child, I despised summer vacation. While my school friends boasted about trips to water parks, county fairs, or bonfires under the vast Texas sky, I had little of my own to recount. For the first 4 years, my summers were as uneventful as a cloudless, searing day on the dusty plains of West Texas. That all changed the summer I turned 11, a summer that would forever haunt my memory with dread and inexplicable terror. Every year, as was our long-held family tradition, my parents sent me off to spend the summer with my grandfather. He lived on an old cattle ranch just outside Bandera, a small town in the Texas Hill Country, known for its weathered legends and stubborn pride. His time-worn farmhouse, built in a style that recalled early pioneer days, stood amid sprawling, parched fields and mesquite groves that whispered secrets of an era long gone. Behind the house, in a dry, murky watering hole that once served as a cattle trough, locals spun chilling tales for generations. They said the pond was cursed, haunted by the restless spirits of those who had met tragic ends under the relentless Texas sun. Grandpa was a tall, gaunt man with a pallid complexion etched by years of hard labor under the brutal sky. His head was kept close-shaven, glistening like worn leather in the midday glare, and his hooked nose lent him an almost spectral appearance. His eyes, dark and steely, never betrayed warmth. Even the rare sight of his only grandchild, whom he saw but once a year, did nothing to soften their hard glint. He dressed exclusively in faded, dusty work shirts, worn denim, and a battered vest that looked more suited for a church service or a funeral than a summer on the range. Hanging on the creaking front door was an old "No Dogs Allowed" sign, an oddity since he kept no animals, a silent admonition hinting at a deep-seated mistrust of outsiders. The long, isolated months on that ranch were pure torment for a modern boy like me. The ancient television set, with its clunky back and unreliable rabbit ear antenna, offered only meager amusement, mostly old religious cartoons or outdated children's shows that belonged to another era entirely. My days were spent poring over dusty books, playing with the few allowed toys, or wandering aimlessly across the barren, sun-baked landscape once my chores were done. Every Sunday, Grandpa would drive me in his old pickup to the modest, whitewashed church in Bandera. During the week, he forced me into all sorts of duties, handing out soup at the local diner, or delivering canned goods to elderly neighbors along cracked, dusty roads. Under the relentless Texas sun, and with not a single shady mesquite in sight, each day felt like an interminable, infernal ordeal. Every evening, we closed the day with a quiet prayer, while the tasteless, water-cooked meals left our mouths yearning for something real. Though Grandpa never showed overt affection, I sensed he cared in his own peculiar way. He would ask if the food suited me and occasionally offer a bedtime story, tales I'd long dismissed as childish fancy. But the summer before my 5th school year was different. That fateful morning, as my mother dropped me off in her aging, rusted Chevy, parked askew on the gravel drive, a strange silence cloaked the property. Standing together on the creaking porch as she knocked on the door, we found not even the chirp of a mockingbird or the rustle of mesquite leaves to break the stillness. It was as if the very land held its breath, while unseen forces watched from the shadows of the scrub. After a long, uneasy pause, Grandpa cracked open the door. His eyes were distant and startled, as if he'd forgotten that my arrival was a yearly certainty. "Are you all right, Grandpa?" my mother asked softly. He blinked, as though emerging from a terrible reverie. mumbled a feeble apology, and ushered us inside. At lunch, we were served meticulously cut tuna sandwiches, triangles arranged like tiny stars, paired with skewered olives and a glass of sweet plum juice. I naively assumed that the summer would follow its usual monotonous course. Yet, within days, unsettling changes began to stir. One early morning, as the outdated alarm clock rang sharply at 6, I sat before the flickering television when I realized the house was unnaturally quiet. No footsteps, no clatter of dishes, only silence. A prickling unease compelled me to turn around, and my heart nearly stopped when I saw Grandpa slumped behind the sagging sofa. In his faded checkered pajamas, his expression was fixed and hollow, as if he were a specter from an old ghost story. In a trembling whisper, he uttered a single word, "More," as if something essential, tied to the ancient curse of that watering hole, was missing. The day unfolded with Grandpa drifting in a state of eerie detachment. At breakfast, he mechanically pushed his food aside while muttering about sleeplessness and a disquiet that clawed at him from within. When I timidly asked if something was wrong, he curtly waved me off and retreated to his room, leaving me with only a growing sense of dread. My inner turmoil swelled as the day wore on. That afternoon, while I aimlessly skipped stones by the watering hole's edge, I noticed an unnatural stillness. No chorus of crickets or gentle breeze rustling the brush. Instead, my eyes fell upon a macabre sight. Dead frogs, rotting turtles, and other lifeless creatures floating on the stagnant water. Near an old tire swing bolted to a gnarled oak, a lone bird lay motionless, encircled by broken eggshells. These ghastly scenes evoked the whispered warnings of the locals, warnings of a curse tied to that forsaken watering hole, a curse that had once reaped a terrible toll on those who dared to come too near. Then came the moment that shattered my fragile sense of normalcy. I heard a strange, bubbling sound emanate from the water. At the very spot where one of my skipped stones landed, ripples formed in a distinct V-shape, as though something beneath the surface was stirring. In that heartbeat, the old stories of water spirits and vengeful souls, legends passed down by old-time Texans and even remnants of native lore, flashed in my mind. I looked up, and for just a split second I thought I glimpsed a vague, human-like outline emerging from the depths. My heart pounding, I dashed back toward the house. From the creaking porch, I dared one last glance at the watering hole. For a fleeting moment, a rounded shape seemed to hover near the waterline. Before I could scrutinize it further, an instinctive alarm urged me to retreat to my room. Inside, I attempted to wake Grandpa, but he was already at the window, staring blankly into the dusk as if transfixed by an unseen horror. "Grandpa, do you see something in the watering hole?" I asked, voice trembling. He stared unseeing at the horizon and murmured, "Flesh." "Flesh? What do you mean?" I pressed, unable to grasp the strange logic. For a moment, he seemed to register my presence, his brow furrowing before he muttered a frustrated, "Damn it," and stormed up the creaking stairs, leaving me with a storm of questions and mounting terror. At a later breakfast that he barely touched, Grandpa mechanically pushed his food around his plate, softly grumbling to himself. When I timidly asked if something was truly amiss, he curtly mentioned he hadn't slept well, and sent me off to rustle up a ham snack in my room. Yet my curiosity, and my fear of this unearthly behavior, compelled me to venture back outside. I crept to the watering hole once more, my eyes darting nervously over my shoulder. Soon, that eerie bubbling returned. As I turned around, a raspy, whispering voice brushed against my ear, as if carried on the wind from the water itself. "The summer isn't over, Eric." I bolted, my footsteps pounding the hard, dusty ground, while behind me an unsettling, almost maniacal laugh mingled with the splash of water, stealing my breath away. In a frantic escape, I finally reached a modest suburban home, a well-kept house in a quiet Bandura neighborhood where evening light still glowed warmly. The residents ushered me inside, provided a meal, and promptly contacted my parents along with the local sheriff. When the authorities arrived, they found no trace of Grandpa at the farmhouse. Later, his body was discovered floating in the dark, stagnant water of the watering hole. His remains decayed and grotesquely disfigured, as if the water itself had left a sinister mark upon him. My parents later speculated that he might have succumbed to a heart attack or even taken his own life, explanations that never made any sense to me. I recall my mother confiding that my grandmother, long before I was born, had met a similarly mysterious end at that very watering hole. She had wandered too far from the bank, as if an unseen force had drawn her beneath the surface. The old legends of Bandera spoke of a curse that haunted that place, a malevolent presence rooted in native lore and whispered by Spanish settlers that dictated the fate of anyone who strayed too close. My parents never discussed these events again, and when I tried to recount the disembodied voice and the ghostly figures I had witnessed, they fell silent, as though they too carried the burden of an unspeakable secret. While they insisted that Grandpa died of natural causes, I knew deep down that I had witnessed something far beyond the ordinary. A presence lurking in the Texas darkness, waiting, ever patient, for its next victim. Perhaps one day the curse will be lifted, or perhaps it will forever haunt that forsaken watering hole, a grim relic of bygone times in the heart of the Lone Star State. One thing is certain, that fateful summer forever altered my life, and the shadow of that night still follows me wherever I go. My sister Emily and I grew up in the small, weathered town of Laredo Bend, a dusty, forgotten settlement on the outskirts of West Texas, where the endless highways and rugged mesas defined daily life, while outsiders sometimes admired the stark beauty of the arid landscape and the sprawling vistas of Palo Duro Canyon in the distance. For us local kids, every day was a monotonous loop of scorching heat, dusty roads, and the unyielding sameness of small-town existence. The only thrill that ever broke the routine was the local legend known as the Rattlesnake Cave Game. The game centered on a mysterious limestone cave tucked away on the edge of a steep bluff near the Guadalupe Mountains. Accessible only by a narrow, precarious trail carved into sun-baked rock, the cave was steeped in eerie lore passed down through generations of Texans. The relentless Texas sun and shifting desert sands made any notion of an easy descent impossible. So we had to muster our courage and navigate the treacherous path with trembling hands. Loose stones, jagged edges, and the constant threat of rockfall forced us to crawl like lizards along the rugged cliff face, always praying that the next climber would notice if we lost our grip. Many of our playmates ended up with scraped knees and a few broken bones from that dangerous trek. Yet, Emily and I always managed to escape, breathless and dusted with red clay. When a brave soul finally reached Rattlesnake Cave, the challenge was to discover a hidden passage in the ancient rock. A secret door said to open only when a series of cryptic rules were followed. These rules ranged from a simple rhythm of knocking on the stone to reciting an old cowboy ballad that nearly everyone believed had been forgotten. No one we knew had ever succeeded. Local whispers claimed that decades earlier, a handful of daring youths had mysteriously vanished after winning the game, their disappearance spoken of in hushed tones at the dusty diners and rundown roadhouses of Laredo Bend. Some said the passage led to hidden gold or a long-lost smuggler's tunnel, while others swore it was a gateway to another realm entirely. A realm that chose its champions without warning. Even though the ominous hints of past tragedies and the perilous climb chilled our bones, Emily and I couldn't resist the lure of the cave's secrets. At least once a week, we would brave the brutal Texas heat and descend into the humid darkness of the cave. Side by side, we pounded our fists against the cool, rough stone, hoping that our determined rhythm might trigger the ancient mechanism or break an old curse. There was no consensus among our ragtag group of local misfits about what lay behind the hidden door. Some of our friends insisted it was the relic of a Prohibition-era bootlegger's smuggling route, or perhaps an abandoned military bunker from the days of old, while others swore it was something far older and supernatural, a passage leading to the very roots of Texas mystery. Then there were those who played only for the thrill, dismissing the legend as nothing more than small-town folklore. Emily and I often joined the latter, trading sardonic jokes as we tapped along the weathered walls, though deep inside, we both harbored an inexplicable certainty that one day one of us would win the game, even if we couldn't explain why or whom fate favored. One sweltering summer afternoon, when our parents were away on a business trip and the days stretched endlessly under the relentless Texas sun, we set out once again to challenge the cave. The usual small-town boredom had grown unbearable. The local BBQ joint and rodeo bar offered little respite from the monotony of daily life. Instead, we resolved to make our way to the bluff, determined to try a new tapping pattern and unlock the cave's secret. The trek was arduous. We clambered down the muddy, sun-cracked slope of the bluff, our voices rough from the heat and our limbs heavy from exhaustion. Dust swirled around us like a living thing, and the distant rumble of a pickup truck and the faint strains of country music drifting from a local honky-tonk only deepened the surreal atmosphere. At the cave's entrance, framed by ancient juniper and mesquite, the air was thick and oppressive. Inside, the cave was scarcely larger than a cramped classroom, its low, arched ceiling nearly brushing the heads of anyone daring enough to stand upright. Every available surface bore the etched initials and crude symbols of generations of local children, and scattered across the ground lay empty soda cans, crumpled cigarette butts, and other relics of past adventures. "Damn all this trash," Emily muttered as she kicked aside a pile of debris. She couldn't stand the thought that careless players, half-hearted in their attempts, might one day trigger the cave's mysterious mechanism before we did. "What's our plan this time?" I asked, referring to the new rhythm we were planning to test along the wall. "Last time, we went 1-2-3, 1-2-3, 1-1. Doesn't it make no sense to repeat the same old thing?" Local lore suggested that an 8-beat rhythm might be the key to opening the hidden passage, though exactly how those beats should fall remained a mystery lost to time. "I don't know," Emily replied thoughtfully. "I was thinking maybe we could try matching it to a heartbeat. 1-2, 1-2, 1-2, 1-2, and work our way around the wall. We could even try 2 patterns at once, see if that speeds things up," I proposed. Emily shook her head firmly. "Last time, your double pattern threw me off completely. I can't concentrate unless we're in sync." I rubbed my calloused hands together, noting how the cave's cool interior stood in stark contrast to the blazing heat outside. "Should we sing the old ballad this time?" I suggested. Raising an eyebrow, Emily gave me a sidelong glance. "You do it. I always feel like a damn fool when I sing." "Maybe that's because you are," I teased, half in jest. "Get off my back," she snapped, though I could see a wry smile tug at her lips as her dark hair fell around her face like the fringe of a worn cowboy hat. "Come on, just speak it if you're uncomfortable," I offered. "But it's a song, isn't it? It only works if you sing it," she insisted. Hell, we don't even know if any of this matters. Maybe a little two-step would work too, I added with a chuckle. In a sudden outburst of frustration, Emily shoved me aside and moved to the far side of the cave. "You're messing everything up. Just stick to the tapping, okay?" she demanded. With that, we both fell into a determined silence. Slowly, we inched along the cool wall, our smartphones providing dim light as we pounded on the stone from the bottom upward in a steady, almost hypnotic rhythm. 1-2, 1-2, 1-2, 1-2. I could hear Emily begin to softly sing, a haunting, measured tune that seemed to blend with the ancient rock as her lips nearly brushed its surface. Rattlesnake Cave, oh dark and grim, open the night so stark and dim. Though the words sounded almost innocent, Emily's clear, powerful voice, once honed in the local church choir before she'd grown shy, now carried a desperate determination. It was as if she was fighting fate itself, striving to become the one who would unravel the mystery of the hidden passage that had swallowed so many before her. I felt an overwhelming urge to triumph alongside her, to conquer the cave as my heart pounded in time with our tapping. Our voices, the clatter of our fists, and the ambient sound of the desert wind created a rhythm that resonated through the cave's shadowy corridors. Until, suddenly, something shifted. An oppressive, creeping unease descended upon us, snuffing out the thrill and replacing it with a terror reminiscent of childhood nights when I'd run from imagined monsters lurking in every dark corner. "Emily," I whispered urgently, "let's get out. We've lost. We can come back next week." But she would not heed my words. Even as her singing died down, she murmured unintelligible words while striking the stone with increasing ferocity. I noticed deep red streaks forming on the weathered rock. "Em, please, stop!" I cried. She whipped around sharply, but before she could utter another word, her right arm suddenly burst through the wall. Not into a hidden chamber or secret passage, but into a yawning abyss of pitch-black void, a darkness so complete that even the feeble light from her phone faltered. Her arm, ensnared up to the elbow by this living darkness, gave way as she lost her balance and plunged into the chasm with a blood-curdling scream. Her scream was swallowed by the void, as if the darkness itself had devoured it. I rushed after her, desperately grabbing at the back of her flapping shirt, but in that terrifying moment the opening sealed shut, replaced by an unyielding, jagged wall. A torn piece of her shirt dangled like a tattered banner, and her phone lay shattered at my feet, its battery ripped away in the chaos. I stood frozen, clutching that scrap of fabric, staring in disbelief at the sealed wall that had claimed my sister. Overcome by horror, I let out a scream, a raw, anguished cry mixing grief, terror, and furious despair at the loss of the only person who had ever truly understood me. Furious, I hammered on the stone until my hands bled, pleading with the unyielding rock to release her, trying to recall the precise tapping pattern that Emily had used. But nothing changed. For what felt like an eternity, I remained there, the oppressive silence and searing heat of the Texas night crushing me, until I finally staggered out of the cave and climbed the rugged bluff, my mind numb and my heart shattered. All around me, the only sounds were the echo of Emily's final scream, the relentless crash of wind against stone, and the deep, unbearable ache of loss. Muddy and dust-covered, I staggered back to town, barely aware of the concerned faces that emerged from pickup trucks and gas stations. My mother's trembling hand on my shoulder, her eyes wide with horror, pierced through the shock as she cried, "Emily, she's gone! God damn it, she's gone!" I screamed in return, my voice mingling with the cacophony of local disbelief and whispered rumors. My parents hauled me into the modest kitchen of our creaking old house, forcing me to sit at the scarred wooden table as I fought against their desperate embraces. They had grown up in Laredo Bend, too, having played the rattlesnake cave game in their youth before dismissing it as a childish superstition. Yet now, as adults, their anguished expressions betrayed the incomprehensible horror of my tale and the bitter reality of Emily's disappearance. In the days that followed, the small town buzzed with rumors. The local sheriff launched an exhaustive investigation, interrogating me until my words ran dry. Volunteers scoured the rocky outcrops and desolate washes near the cave, searching for a body or any sign of foul play. When nothing was found, I faced further questioning, with insinuations that I might have been responsible for Emily's injury, or even tried to cover up the unexplainable events. Nothing could be proven except that I had been driven to a state of utter hysteria. My parents, silently burdened by guilt and despair, fought fiercely in local media, distributing flyers at the town's dusty gas stations, giving impassioned interviews on the local radio station, and gathering every scrap of hope that Emily might still be found. Their desperate efforts took a toll, leaving them gaunt and broken, like survivors of a relentless drought. Over time, they drifted further from me, and the growing chasm in our family deepened when I was suspended from school after a violent altercation with a classmate named Samuel Thompson. "Did you hear your sister won the rattlesnake cave game?" Samuel sneered one crowded hallway, trailing me with a greasy smirk. "How'd you even manage that?" He wasn't the first to mock me, but when he saw the haunted look in my eyes, the other students quickly backed away. Yet Samuel persisted, following me even as I tried to blend into the throng of disaffected teens. "You're talking trash," he jeered. "Bet you've never even set foot near that cursed cave." "Oh yeah?" I snapped, my anger flaring. "Then where's my sister?" Samuel shrugged, his self-satisfied grin widening. "Probably ran off with some drifter. Everyone knows how she was." In a blind surge of fury, I struck him hard across the face, only to be separated by a throng of classmates before the fight escalated further. In the weeks that followed, barred from school and haunted by the cave's grim legacy, I drifted in a daze between the barren outskirts and the lonely confines of home, waiting for a sign of Emily's return, a sign that I dreaded might never come. Sometimes, when I ran my hand along the coarse walls of the cave, I could almost hear her anguished cries or catch a whisper of her voice, as if she were desperately trying to convey her suffering from within the darkness. More often, it was just the mournful howl of the wind or the distant call of a lone coyote under the starry Texas sky. Yet, in my heart, the echo of all those lost souls, children and dreamers swallowed by the cavern, remained an ever-present reminder of the cave's sinister appetite. For years, I shuttled between the ghostly ruins of my past and the barren present of Laredo Bend, until, in my later youth, my mother fell gravely ill with a heart condition. My father sank into a deep depression, overwhelmed by loss and unable to care for her, and soon my life became a series of bleak days tethered to their sorrow. I carried with me a crushing guilt, convinced that if I had never pushed her away with a careless word, Emily might never have been claimed by the cursed cave. In time, I even forgot the closeness we once shared, resigning myself to the belief that Emily was always destined to be a player of the rattlesnake cave game, and that it was only my terrible timing that had forced me to witness her vanishing. My mother died when I was 20, and my father could barely meet my eyes as we laid her to rest in the small weathered cemetery at the edge of town. A few months later, he succumbed suddenly to a heart attack, leaving me alone in the hollow shell of our old house, a house filled with memories too painful to bear. I sank into a loneliness I felt I had earned. Then, one stifling summer night the following year, a persistent knock shattered the silence at my front door. I lay in bed, hungover and reluctant to face another day, when the tapping grew louder. First at the door, then at the windows. When it finally reached the glass, I staggered down the creaking wooden steps and hesitantly opened the door. Standing before me was a young girl with wet, disheveled hair plastered to her face and sand streaking her features like a half-worn mask. She couldn't have been more than 16, yet there was a strange, almost ancient weight in her gaze, as if the hardships of life in this harsh land had etched their mark upon her soul. I recognized her immediately. It was my sister, but how could she stand here so unchanged? With a trembling hand, I held her at bay. "Won't you let me in?" she asked in a voice that was identical to the Emily I remembered, yet somehow flat and lifeless. "No," I stammered, shaking with disbelief. "You're not Emily. That can't be. You're still in that accursed cave. You're dead. I saw what happened." She shook her head slowly, and in her eyes the warm brown of our childhood had faded into an unfathomable black. "The cave set me free," she whispered. "Everyone who won before me, they're still there." A wave of weakness washed over me as I clung to the door like it was my only lifeline. "I don't understand," I murmured. "What do you mean?" "Just let me in and I'll explain," she pleaded softly. With no clear alternative, I stepped aside and allowed her into the dim interior of our home. Emily still wore that delicate faded pink t-shirt from the day of the game, a shirt torn at the back where it had snagged on the rocky edge of the cave. For a long moment I wondered if my exhausted mind had conjured up a ghost. But when she passed by and her hand brushed my arm, I felt the unmistakable warmth of a living being. We settled into the sparse light of our living room, and after a heavy silence I finally asked, "What was that opening in the cave? The crack you fell into?" "Alive," she answered simply. I burst into hysterical laughter. "How can a cave be alive?" "It only seems that way," she explained in a soft, measured tone. "I believe it's a creature, a being. Some of the kids who played here long ago called it by a name. And this game, it isn't about rules or winning. It chooses whom it lets in whenever it feels like it." I studied her face, now etched with a solemn gravity that mirrored the darkest moments we'd experienced in that haunted cavern. "How do you know it chooses people?" I asked hesitantly. "Because it spoke to us," she replied quietly. I could hear its voice in my head, as if the darkness itself whispered a secret. It called itself Rattlesnake, like an ancient legend carved into the very heart of Texas. I wiped the sweat from my brow as memories of that terrible night surged back. When it swallowed me, I heard the cries of children, pleading, desperate cries of those who'd never escape. They were frozen in time, as if the cave wanted to preserve them forever. I heard them, but none of us could truly understand. Emily lowered her head into her arms and fell silent, leaving me to wonder how much of herself she'd lost in those long, unyielding years of darkness. Perhaps even her very soul. "People will keep playing the Rattlesnake Cave game," Emily finally murmured. "It doesn't matter what you do or say. It will always choose someone, whenever it fancies it." My name is Mark. I'm 26 years old, and I recently started a new job as a night shift caregiver at Lone Star Haven, a long-established nursing facility tucked away in the small, weathered town of San Augustine, Texas. Tired of the frantic pace of retail, I sought a career that promised more meaning and fulfillment. Lone Star Haven occupies an old red brick building constructed in the early 1950s, a relic of post-war Texas whose history is woven into local lore. Locals whisper about strange occurrences in its shadowed hallways, and the building's creaks and groans are said to echo secrets of a bygone era. Before taking the helm of my duties, I endured an intensive training period. I spent 2 grueling weeks in classroom sessions at the central office in downtown Austin, learning everything from patient care protocols to emergency procedures, and then 2 weeks shadowing the night shift of my predecessor, a seasoned Texan caregiver named Jack. Jack, with his steady drawl and firm handshake, took me under his wing, explaining every nuance of Lone Star Haven, from the personalities of its residents to the quirks of its ancient plumbing and drafty corridors. At Lone Star Haven, residents is the respectful term we use for the 10 seniors who live here. 5 men and 5 women, each relying on assistance for daily tasks. When I began, only 4 of the women were still with us. Nancy, a vibrant soul known for her love of painting with her fingertips, had passed away not long ago. In her former room, I discovered her bright, Texan-inspired artwork. Lively handprint motifs, sketches of bluebonnets and wildflowers, and ghostly figures that evoked the tall tales told around campfires on sultry Texas nights. On her neatly made bed lay handmade cards, tokens of love and shared sorrow from the other residents. Nancy had always insisted on leaving her window shades wide open, as if to keep one eye on the sprawling mesquite groves outside, a ritual that lent her room an air of bittersweet connection to the vast Texas sky. The first few weeks blurred together in a haze of learning and routine. Jack warned me that some residents were prone to falls. Given their frailty, it was essential to conduct rounds every 2 hours and be on high alert for any unusual sounds that might signal trouble. On the final day of training, while sitting in the facility's old kitchen, its walls adorned with faded tin tiles and a persistent scent of strong coffee, Jack leaned in and confided a chilling detail. The building sometimes emitted inexplicable creaks and groans late at night, as if the very bones of the house were shifting. He even described moments when shadows in the dim corridors morphed into human silhouettes, and he swore he once saw a spectral hand glide past a door frame before vanishing into darkness. I was raised in Texas with a healthy skepticism, yet even I couldn't help but feel a shiver as I listened. 3 months into my job, I had yet to encounter anything that defied explanation until last evening. It was 11:20 p.m., and after my regular rounds confirmed that all residents were fast asleep and every appliance was turned off, I settled in the sparsely lit rec room. The only light came from a single, flickering ceiling fixture, casting long, wavering shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Out of the silence, a distinct ker-thunk echoed down the women's wing. My first thought was that Mrs. Elizabeth might have taken an unplanned tumble out of bed. But when I checked her room, I found her safely and carefully repositioned. Perhaps it was Mrs. Abigail. Yet her room, too, was undisturbed. Methodically, I inspected every room, Mrs. Charlotte's, Mrs. Pam's, and all appeared as they should. In an old building like this one, I reasoned, strange noises were not uncommon. The creaks could be attributed to settling foundations and the cool Texas night air. I returned to my laptop to work through an online training module, but within minutes, the ker-thunk resounded again. I rose, retraced my steps through the darkened corridors, secured all the windows against the chill autumn breeze, and verified that every door was locked, even in Nancy's former room, whose door I had left ajar earlier. I shut the door firmly, convincing myself that the crisp desert wind was the culprit. However, the sound grew louder with each occurrence. By the 3rd time, it seemed more insistent, and on the 4th, a sudden, jarring ka-chunk shattered the night. In that heartbeat, the hum of the aging air conditioner and even the soft buzzing of the rec room light died, replaced by an oppressive, all-consuming silence. I stood, heart pounding, half expecting a cry for help from somewhere in the maze of rooms, half hoping the dreadful cold would vanish. With a deep, resigned sigh, I resumed my rounds through the corridors. A nagging fear crept over me that perhaps someone was breaking in, as old buildings in rural Texas sometimes attract nefarious characters. I meticulously checked the men's wing, then the rooms of Mrs. Elizabeth, Mrs. Abigail, Mrs. Charlotte, and Mrs. Pam, but found no sign of an intruder. After nearly 40 minutes of anxious patrolling and restless deliberation, I decided to take a short break. I pulled out my cell phone and scanned the local news. A mixture of county updates and debates over new oil drilling proposals that were all too familiar in these parts, while nibbling on a turkey sandwich and sipping a glass of sweet iced tea. So absorbed was I in the local headlines that I almost missed the sound. A soft, deliberate footstep echoing down the women's corridor, as if someone heavy-footedly made their way along the hall. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, as a deep sense of foreboding compelled me not to turn around. The only ambient sound remained the low, constant hum of that lone ceiling light. After that unnerving moment passed, I resolved that for the remainder of the night every light in the facility, across corridors, kitchens, and bathrooms, would remain on. I quietly played some soothing country ballads on my phone, trying to calm my nerves. The eerie sounds did not return for the rest of the shift, and after 2 more rounds checking the residence rooms, I began to think that perhaps it had all been a trick of my tired mind. Yet, during the final round, as I inspected the men's quarters and the rooms of Mrs. Elizabeth, Mrs. Abigail, Mrs. Charlotte, and Mrs. Pam, something odd caught my eye. The door to Nancy's former room was slightly ajar, even though I had closed it moments before, and despite the fact that morning shift colleagues had already gathered in the common area. A chill ran down my spine. Though every rational thought told me not to intrude, curiosity overpowered me, and I slowly opened the door. Everything appeared just as I had left it, until I noticed the window. There, faintly etched into the glass, was the outline of a handprint. At first, I assumed someone must have peered through from outside, but the print was unmistakably pressed from the inside, as though someone had deliberately laid their hand against the pane. Had it formed recently? The impression was subtle, yet I was certain it hadn't been there before. A cold dread overtook me. I retrieved one of Nancy's cherished paintings, a delicate piece depicting a field of bluebonnets under a vast starlit sky, and held it against the window. The colors and patterns of the painting seemed to merge perfectly with the mysterious handprint. Just then, a colleague called out to me, and I hastily returned the painting, desperately trying to banish the eerie vision from my mind. At dawn, I drove home along the long, dusty roads of East Texas, my thoughts tangled like the mesquite thickets along the roadside. I played a few rounds of video games in a vain attempt to steady my nerves, but sleep eluded me. It's hard to settle in a place shadowed by such inexplicable events, even when the first warm light of sunrise timidly pierces the drawn curtains. Yet the next day, as I returned to work, the echo of that haunting kerthunk lingered in my memory, leaving me to wonder if this storied building harbors more dark secrets than its weathered facade dares reveal. I live in an ancient Texas homestead, a true relic of eras past in the heart of the Lone Star State. Originally built in the early 1800s as a sprawling ranch house on a vast plot of land near a now-forgotten cattle town, the property was later divided into 2 separate residences by the 1850s to accommodate the growing frontier. In what once was my front yard, a once bustling rail depot connected the local community to the far-flung reaches of the Southwest, a vital artery reminiscent of those gritty, dust-choked hubs that fueled Texas's expansion. With such a storied past, it was hardly surprising that tragedy, mysterious deaths, and, according to local lore, passed down over generations. Ghostly apparitions had become part of its legacy. One legend, in particular, spoke of the White Lady, a spectral figure said to wander these grounds, her pallid face a perpetual reminder of lost hope and unfulfilled promises. I, Matthew, had never been one to entertain ghost stories or the supernatural. I prided myself on finding logical explanations for every odd occurrence, until the night that shattered all my certainties and challenged the very essence of reason. My basement is a dark, unfinished space that bears the unmistakable mark of time's slow decay. Massive stone walls, their rough plaster chipped and weathered by relentless Texas sun and violent storms, seem to murmur silent tales of generations past. The floor is a patchwork of compacted clay and scattered remnants of old wooden beams, while the ceiling, barely a head-high barrier, gives the room an oppressively claustrophobic feel. It's bitterly cold down there, even more so than a winter's night on the plains. And woe to anyone daring to descend in flimsy boots, for worn soles and battered heels are an inevitability. Yet all these physical hardships pale in comparison to the true mystery that haunts the depths of this house. Every time I venture into the basement, without fail, the door is found slightly ajar. The entrance itself is peculiar, an unassuming inner door that remains securely locked from the inside, coupled with two massive, rusted metal doors on the exterior. These doors, their dark green finish worn and pitted by decades of harsh weather and scorching heat, appear almost fused together as if by some unseen force. Beyond them lies a narrow flight of stairs leading to an old wooden door. Even if one musters the strength to force open the stubborn metal barriers, the wooden door is secured from within by a slippery, antiquated sliding bolt. A mechanism with a faded, almost chalk-white finish that defies the logic of modern locks. Under normal circumstances, everyone in town steers clear of the basement. It is cold, foreboding, and appears utterly devoid of any immediate value. Yet this strange door, as if guided by its own will, always remains just a fraction open. I often jest with my kin over barbecue dinners and evening porch sittings. Whenever the supernatural is mentioned, I half-seriously remark that they should take a closer look at that recalcitrant sliding bolt. A lock that stubbornly refuses to behave as any proper Texan door should. Usually, the gap is no more than a couple of inches, never fully open. We only descend to check on its state. Open, close, lock, then retreat back upstairs. But in recent weeks, the door's peculiar behavior took on a far more menacing tone. At first, the gap was a mere 3/4 of an inch. I closed and locked it as usual. The following week, the gap widened to nearly an inch, barely noticeable yet unnerving. Then, in the third week, it suddenly swung half open. Though unsettling, I dismissed it as one of the odd quirks inherent to old Texas homes. After all, a door that opens on its own isn't unheard of in these parts. I closed it, locked it, and left the basement. However, during the 4th and 5th weeks, the gap reached alarming proportions. Each time, the door swung wide enough to nearly brush against the adjacent wall, a sight that sent an icy shudder down my spine. The dusty, clay-stained floor showed no footprints or signs of intrusion. It remained the same cold, damp chamber, yet now with the door completely unlatched. And still, as always, I closed it, locked it, and exited. Whenever I recounted these strange occurrences to my neighbors at the local diner, or during chats at the feed store, they'd ask, "Why won't your basement door stay shut?" My only response, with a rueful smile, was, "It seems my basement door just refuses to close." On my 6th descent, however, the door was, to my surprise, closed and firmly locked. I stepped down to verify that everything had returned to normal, and indeed, all appeared as it should. Just as I turned to leave, I misstepped on the third stair. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a faint, almost imperceptible click, the sound of that sliding bolt releasing. My eyes were fixed on it as a thin gap slowly formed between the door and its frame, accompanied by a long, agonizing creak, as though some invisible force were prying it open. A cold wave of terror swept over me as every hair on my arms and back stood on end, and I could not tear my eyes away from what lay beyond the widening door. Frozen on those creaking steps, I watched in disbelief as the door snapped shut, and in its place, instead of the familiar view of 3 gray concrete steps leading back to the metal doors, there appeared a small platform from which a long, steep staircase descended into darkness. This staircase, illuminated only by sporadic, dim lanterns placed about every 20 feet along its length, exuded an otherworldly glow that was both inviting and terrifying. A part of me screamed to retreat immediately and slam the door shut, while another, equally curious part urged me to venture further into this mysterious passage. Hesitantly, I released the cold, rusty railing, ducked beneath the low-hanging support beams and dusty ventilation ducts, and inched closer to the enigmatic opening. An unshakable dread crept up my spine as I realized that this staircase seemed to plunge deeper than I had ever imagined possible. What could be down there? I whispered, my voice barely audible. My mind overflowed with questions as a chill of terror gripped every fiber of my being. The staircase was dark, desolate, and inexplicably pristine despite its age. I reached out to touch the rough, porous walls, reminiscent of the weathered limestone found in parts of West Texas. The entire descent was shrouded in a gloomy, muted gray, lit only by the weak glow of distant lanterns. No sooner had I stepped onto the platform than an overwhelming sense of foreboding washed over me. I shouldn't be going down there, I tried to tell myself. But as any true Texan knows, curiosity can be as relentless as the desert sun. Step by step, I continued downward. With each creaking stair, the air grew subtly warmer, as if I were nearing another realm entirely. When I finally turned to look back, the path I had come by had vanished, leaving only the shadowy, dark gray steps stretching into both the depths below and the forgotten past above. With a resigned sigh, I pressed on until, after about 10 long minutes, something began to materialize at the foot of the staircase. A floor bathed in a faint, ghostly light, noticeably brighter than the surrounding stone. Cautiously, I advanced, even though there was no handrail to guide me, and as I neared, the murky light seemed to break through the darkness in reluctant glimmers. At last, I reached the floor, but on the penultimate step I lost my footing, stumbled, and tumbled down hard. I bruised my hand in the fall, though thankfully nothing more serious occurred. As I gathered myself, I surveyed the room into which I had crashed, and realized it was not the familiar basement I had always known, but an exact, eerie replica of it. Yet everything felt profoundly different. There was no visible exit except for the narrow staircase by which I had descended, and a strange ventilation duct near the floor caught my attention. I knelt down and approached the narrow, barred metal hatch, peered through its tiny openings, and tugged at it cautiously, but it refused to budge. Reluctantly, I stepped back. While exploring the uncanny room further, I noticed additional subtle changes. Extra ventilation ducts that hadn't been there before, slight depressions in the floor where none had existed, and areas where the ceiling now loomed higher than it had in my memory. And then, I heard it. Amid my own labored breaths, I detected a second, irregular sound of breathing. It was scarcely louder than my own, Yet, in the pauses between each inhale and exhale, it sounded menacing and utterly foreign. I frantically searched for its source, but it remained hidden in the oppressive gloom. My logical mind urged me to retrace my steps, to return to each strange anomaly, each suspicious vent, until I reached the very first grill that had caught my eye. There, the sound of breathing grew louder, a soft rasp against my skin that soon deepened into a quiet, almost guttural growl. Overwhelmed by fear, I retreated, crawling on my hands and knees toward the staircase, my palms scraping raw against the cool stone. The growl shifted into a sorrowful sigh, then into a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated through the still air. When I finally reached the staircase again and began climbing, a sudden, loud screech of metal from a grated wall shattered the eerie silence, followed by frantic, scratching sounds. Something had burst forth from that cursed ventilation duct. Without a backward glance, I transformed my measured pace into a desperate sprint. I was determined to escape this hellish mirror of my own basement. Whatever sinister presence now pursued me cared little for whether I could understand its nature. The only priority was to flee this labyrinthine stairwell as quickly as possible. I ran, faster and faster, until my legs grew numb and my head pounded with relentless pain. Yet the terror was never far behind. When I finally reached the upper landing, a surge of adrenaline filled me with renewed determination. My heart hammered as I slammed the door shut with every ounce of strength, the deafening crash of splintering wood and shattering metal echoing through the silent Texas night. Seconds later, I felt that unearthly force closing in. I bolted up the second flight of stairs, dashed out of the basement, and reached the main house, an old homestead that, despite its deserted appearance, now pulsed with a haunting emptiness. No sooner had I shut the front door than I heard a sinister crash from below, the sound of the wooden door shattering under the force of its impact. Without hesitating, I burst out into the cool Texas evening. Outside, standing in my overgrown front yard, where wild bluebonnets and scraggly mesquite trees swayed in the gentle breeze, I paused to catch my breath. As I turned to look back at the house, a chilling sight froze me in place. Reflected in the stained glass window of the front door were a pair of piercing brown eyes, framed by dark, disheveled hair, and a pale, almost spectral complexion, fixed intently on me. My heart sank, and my eyes widened in a mixture of horror and disbelief. Was that me? The grim legend whispered in the backroads and small towns of Texas, the tale of the White Lady, who was said to have met a tragic fate within these very walls, now seemed to materialize before my eyes on that fateful night. In that moment, as the boundaries between reality and myth blurred into one terrifying truth, I knew I had become witness to an event that transcended the ordinary and plunged deep into the realm of the truly supernatural. Some say that landing a job that lets you retire at 20 is a dream come true. But when you work in West Texas tracking down the unexplainable, it's anything but paradise. After all, a life suddenly free of worry can quickly become mind-numbingly dull, unless you're flush with cash. And even then, the job that promised early retirement was never really worth the price from the start. I was once employed on a 5-year contract by the enigmatic Walker family, a bloodline as old as the dusty legends whispered around campfires on the barren plains of Texas. The Walkers were steeped in local lore, their roots entwined with the very history of the state, and they preferred to remain hidden in the long shadows of old ghost stories. Though the contract paid generously, it wasn't renewed. Apparently, constant exposure to supernatural forces was believed to warp the mind beyond repair. That, however, didn't stop me from chasing the unexplainable. I loved my work, and I was damn good at it. Only 1 in 10 paranormal hunters ever made it through an entire case without losing their nerve. I firmly believed that anyone who used common sense rather than chasing after a quick buck could become a skilled investigator of the otherworldly. Still, most of my colleagues signed contracts worth millions, blissfully ignorant of the real risks lurking behind every shadow on the dusty back roads of Texas. Drawn by the lure of a mystery that defied explanation, I found myself in the remote outskirts of a small town near Big Bend, a place where even the wind seemed to whisper old secrets. Our town sat on the edge of a notorious stretch of highway locals had dubbed the Devil's Pass, a trail rumored to be soaked in ancient, potent magic. In recent years, my investigations had often ended with nothing more than mild paranoia, much like the inexplicable mold outbreaks in abandoned ranch houses. But this case was different. In the brutal winter months, 4 people had vanished under circumstances that defied logic. In remote Texan communities, it wasn't unheard of for someone to disappear without a trace, often leaving behind only an abandoned pickup on a lonely dirt road, only to reappear when spring thaw uncovered buried memories. But this winter, the disappearances had come in rapid succession. The missing weren't simply lost in the vast desert. They'd been seen one night only to vanish, as if swallowed by the thirsty earth by morning. The local newspaper had even whispered of a serial killer, and the sheriff's department was on high alert. I, however, suspected something far more otherworldly was at play. My own investigations of deserted homesteads revealed no sign of a human predator. I had a knack, almost a sixth sense, for detecting residual magic. Every entity leaves behind a signature, a glimmer of supernatural energy that, to me, was as legible as an open ledger. Some beings were clever enough to mask their tracks, but most left them behind like neon signs in the darkness. These spectral traces allowed me to reconstruct the events with a precision that was both unnerving and exhilarating. This particular series of cases was perplexing, not because the force was adept at hiding its tracks, but because it left them in a brazen, almost mocking fashion. The homes of the vanished were awash with swirling, silver energy that danced in the cold night air like reflections on a polished saloon mirror. Under the clear, starry skies of West Texas, this otherworldly glow rivaled even the brilliance of a desert sunrise. Despite the challenge in gauging the full extent of this entity's power, its arrival was unmistakable, like a wild bronco charging through a quiet general store. Hunting the paranormal in Texas is far from glamorous. Much of the time is spent waiting in isolation, perched on the edge of long-forgotten ghost towns, eyes scanning the horizon for that single sign of a creature's movement. I often found myself alone under the vast expanse of a midnight sky, keeping my wits about me while savoring greasy late-night barbecues at roadside diners. But one fateful night, my wait was cut short by an urgent call that rattled even my steely nerves. It was 2 a.m. in my battered pickup, its radio softly playing a classic country tune, when my scanner lit up with a frantic alert. "Sheriff, do you copy? This is Sheriff Thompson. There's an emergency out near the Hollister homestead," came the gravelly voice over the radio. On the other end, the steady drawl of local law enforcement crackled through. "Yeah, I'm listening. Go ahead, Miss Carter," Sheriff Thompson replied. "Miss Carter here. Your husband has been reported missing. We need you to mobilize immediately," she said. Sheriff Thompson's voice carried a hint of resignation. "I'm on my way, though I reckon old Mr. Hollister has wandered off again in his confused state." The Hollisters were a kindly, elderly couple, lifelong residents whose romance was the stuff of local legend. Mr. Hollister, afflicted with advancing dementia, was known to roam aimlessly on moonlit nights. But given the recent spate of mysterious vanishings, I couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister was afoot. I decided to head out myself. I drove past the weathered, whitewashed farmhouse of the Hollisters long before Sheriff Thompson's cruiser pulled up. Almost immediately, it was clear that this was no ordinary case of an old man lost in the dark. The property and the dusty trail leading up to it vibrated with erratic bursts of raw magical energy, a sure sign of an otherworldly presence. I knew I had to act fast to rescue Mr. Hollister before he fell prey to whatever was stalking him. After another mile along a deserted stretch of road, I spotted a glimmering trail veering off into a thicket of mesquite and scrub. I pulled over, switched my truck into park, opened the back, and grabbed my well-worn case of tools. The case felt light, yet was packed with every gadget a seasoned paranormal investigator in Texas might need. Without hesitation, I ventured into the dark, whispering brush. It had been a long time since I'd embarked on such an electrifying hunt, and the surge of adrenaline almost made me forget the lurking danger. Under a sky studded with stars and guided only by the pulsating shimmer of residual magic along Devil's Pass, the scene felt as surreal as a long-forgotten frontier legend. My excitement, however, made me careless. I soon overlooked the devious traps that supernatural beings in these parts are notorious for. Upon reaching a small clearing, I found Mr. Hollister seated motionless at its center, encircled by fresh, restless magic. I figured I could quietly secure the old man, get him to safety, and then track down the creature responsible. My misplaced confidence, however, would prove fatal. Barely had I stepped into the clearing when a tremendous crash echoed through the mesquite grove, like a boulder had tumbled through the scrub. Reflexively, I ducked, narrowly evading a shower of debris, yet failed to spot a concealed trap. With a violent thud, my head slammed against a fallen oak, and everything went black. When I came to, the night was as pitch black as a Texas coal mine, and nearly every trace of magic had dissipated. I heard a faint rustling in my tool bag, but without the guiding glow of supernatural energy, I could barely make out anything. My frantic struggle to free myself from the trap seemed to provoke the unseen presence. I sensed it lifting its head, and though I couldn't see its face in the inky darkness, I knew instantly it was watching me. "You sure have an impressive array of tools, Hunter." A mocking, almost sardonic voice sneered from the gloom. I froze. Not only could this creature speak, it also knew exactly who I was. In that heart-stopping moment, genuine terror gripped me, a sensation I had seldom experienced in all my years chasing shadows in the Texas night. "If you let me out of here, you'll regret it. I'll make sure you—" I began, only to be cut off. "Ha ha, human," it retorted with a chilling chuckle. "You won't get away that easily. And when my employer, my mentor, finds out, he'll put a bullet in your supernatural behind," I threatened. A creature that could talk and coordinate with others left only one grim possibility. But before I could dwell on that thought, a blinding white light tore through the darkness. Unbridled, raw magic enveloped me, and the ropes binding me snapped with a violent jerk, sending me sprawling onto the cold, unforgiving ground. Lying there on the hard, dusty soil, gasping for air, I noticed a subtle movement amid the dying light. Right before me, on the frosty ground, stood a diminutive creature, no taller than a yard, but unmistakably cunning in local legend. In Texan folklore, such tricksters were known for their mischief and irreverence, akin to the legends of small-town spirits and desert fairies. "Sit tight and wait it out," the impish creature quipped, before nimbly approaching Mr. Hollister and gently tapping his forehead. As if bewitched, the elderly man immediately rose, ready to follow the tiny being's every command. With a mocking glance in my direction, the little trickster turned and vanished into the starless darkness alongside Mr. Hollister. "Have a little fun for me. The real party starts when I get back," it called over its shoulder. Left alone in that eerie clearing, I watched them disappear into the night. It would be a long while before that impish creature returned. After all, an old man can't outpace a mystical guide. With no other choice, I steeled myself for the next stage of this bizarre pursuit. And so it is still told on those long silent nights in West Texas. A tale of an eerie evening when the lines between the real and the paranormal blurred so completely that it sent shivers down the spine of every local who heard it. It was a case that chilled the blood of even the bravest souls and rekindled the old legends of the Lone Star State. I hardly expect anyone to believe this tale. I'm not even sure I do myself. But I had to share it. I needed someone to listen, someone who might understand, or perhaps have experienced something similar. Because lately, it feels as though I'm slowly losing my grip on reality. Back then, I was a broke college student from Austin, scraping by on a shoestring budget, when I discovered an unbelievably affordable rental in a decrepit farmhouse on the outskirts of Llano, a tiny, isolated town in the heart of Texas. I thought, this is exactly what I need. Sure, it sounded like the plot of a horror film, something reminiscent of The Conjuring, but I was desperate for a quiet place to live and study, no matter the cost. The first 2 weeks were uneventful. I hauled in my few belongings and settled into the rustic isolation of the farmhouse, tucked away on a dusty stretch of road surrounded by sprawling mesquite groves and rugged hill country. The silence was almost comforting, but soon an inexplicable odor began to invade the space. At first, I assumed it was a dead critter, maybe a raccoon or a possum left to rot under the relentless Texas sun. But the stench was far stronger, clinging to every room with a persistence that defied explanation. Then, as if that wasn't enough, I started finding tiny handprints on the grimy windows and smeared on the old, tarnished mirrors. I'd never been one to believe in ghosts, but those markings sent a chill straight down my spine. Days passed, and the smell only grew more oppressive. So much so that even the constant breeze from the nearby Llano River couldn't dispel it. I sprayed every kind of air freshener I could find and scrubbed every nook and cranny, yet nothing worked. With midterms looming, I tried to focus on my studies, refusing to let the eerie odor and unsettling signs distract me. Then, the truly bizarre events began. One sweltering morning, I discovered that my keys were missing from their usual spot on the worn wooden counter. I was positive I'd left them there. Frantically searching every room, I found no trace of them, even though I lived alone, with no roommates or unexpected visitors. At first, I blamed my own absent-mindedness, thinking maybe a friend had borrowed them during a brief visit. But soon enough, the mystery repeated itself. Items would vanish, only to reappear in completely different places, as if moved by an unseen hand. But the strangest occurrences were the sightings. Initially, I caught fleeting glimpses of shifting shadows at the edge of my vision, vague, dark forms that disappeared when I turned to look directly. I told myself it was just exhaustion from long nights at the local diner, sipping a lukewarm cup of Whataburger coffee before my early morning classes. Yet, the phenomenon intensified. At night, I began hearing soft footsteps echoing down the creaky wooden halls, whispered voices too faint to decipher, and even the sound of gentle tapping against the walls. I kept these experiences to myself, chalking them up to an overactive imagination, or the natural groans of an old farmhouse settling under the Texas heat. One muggy summer evening, as I lay in bed fighting off sleep, An ear-splitting scream tore through the stillness, a scream that vibrated with raw anguish and terror. My heart pounded as I leaped from the bed, convinced someone was in distress. I bolted out into the moonlit yard, where the only light came from a distant oil lamp at the local gas station. But outside, there was only an oppressive silence, the vast, empty Texas landscape stretching out in every direction. I stood there for what felt like hours, questioning if my mind had played tricks on me. Yet the memory of that blood-curdling cry remained indelibly real. Returning inside, I tried to dismiss my fear as a bad dream fueled by stress. But as I climbed the creaking staircase, I heard it again. A deafening bang as the door to my bedroom slammed shut. A door that had never had a lock, mind you. I tugged desperately at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. A wave of pure panic washed over me. In my desperation, I called the Llano County Sheriff's Department. When the deputies arrived, they barely spared a glance at my frantic recounting. "Probably just a raccoon or a stray dog," one of them said dismissively, after a cursory search that turned up no evidence of any forced entry or disturbance. Just a few days later, an insidious scratching began along the walls, a subtle, almost imperceptible sound that seemed to originate deep within the very bones of the house, sending shivers down my spine each time it emerged. In the following days, the unexplained events escalated into full-blown terror. Those fleeting shadows coalesced into distinct human-like figures, dark silhouettes with hollow eyes that lurked in the corners of my vision before vanishing as quickly as they appeared. I began to feel as though I was constantly being watched, my every move monitored by some unseen presence. My sense of reality blurred as I questioned whether I was on the brink of insanity. The most disturbing occurrences, however, were the nocturnal sounds. Night after night, soft, ghostly whispers crept into my ears, voices that sounded like children, crying out for help, as if pleading from the depths of a long-forgotten torment. One night, I was roused by the sound of high-pitched, eerie giggling that reverberated through the entire house. I raced into the living room, my heart pounding, only to find it empty. Yet the laughter persisted, echoing from every shadowed corner, filling the silence with an unsettling, almost mocking melody. It was in that moment I realized this wasn't just an old abandoned farmhouse. It was a cursed place, haunted by secrets too terrible to comprehend. That realization marked the turning point. Without a word, I packed my few belongings and fled that accursed property, not even bothering to inform my landlord. I spent several weeks holed up with my family in Austin, far removed from the terror of that isolated farmhouse. Then, one day, driven by a mix of lingering attachment and the need for closure, I returned to retrieve some forgotten items. What I found left me utterly speechless. The once familiar farmhouse was now cordoned off by bright yellow police tape, with deputies scouring the property. The house I remembered had been reduced to nothing more than a smoldering pile of ash, a haunting remnant that served as the sole evidence of its prior existence. A few days later, local news outlets reported a grim discovery. During the demolition, authorities had unearthed human remains, tiny bones, unmistakably those of a child, concealed deep within the ruins. The discovery suggested that these gruesome relics had been hidden away for years, buried under layers of neglect and decay. I never spoke of it again. No one believed my story, and I had an airtight alibi. Yet deep down, I knew that the house had been destroyed for a very good reason. Those tormented souls, the unseen children whose voices still echo in my ears, were never truly at rest. Every time I close my eyes, I hear their soft, desperate calls, repeating my name over and over. I've told this story countless times, but the horror remains as palpable as ever. And to this day, I wonder if I'm losing my mind, or if those restless spirits still linger in the dark corners of my memory. As I sit here in the dim light of my truck on the outskirts of Marfa, trying to piece together a coherent thought from that fateful night, my mind relentlessly drifts back to the cursed hours we spent at the abandoned Buckner State Hospital. Nestled in a forgotten corner of West Texas, its decaying brick walls and shattered windows concealed unspeakable horrors beneath the vast, starlit sky. The sharp tang of rust and decay, mixed with the lingering odor of stale antiseptic and dust, clung to the air like an unyielding curse. My mind had fought hard to block out the brutal truth, but tonight I must face it. And I share this account in the hope that it serves as a dire warning about meddling with forces beyond our mortal ken. It all began with what we believed to be nothing more than an innocent adventure. A ragtag group of 10 college friends from Dallas, self-proclaimed urban explorers and seekers of the paranormal, had caught wind of the infamous Buckner State Hospital, long abandoned and steeped in local legends of ghostly apparitions and inexplicable happenings. We were thrill seekers armed with modern gadgets, high-definition cameras, infrared night vision scopes, digital recorders, and of course, a trusty pickup truck to haul our equipment and supplies. Though local folklore warned of sinister happenings in the long deserted corridors of Buckner, we dismissed it as tall tales until that midnight when reality proved far more horrifying. Our journey began under a moonless sky. At precisely midnight, we arrived at the hospital, a hulking, desolate structure that stood like a haunted monument against the dark Texas horizon. Our truck's headlights barely penetrated the oppressive darkness as we stepped out, the sound of gravel crunching under our boots. The building's towering facade, with its broken arches and crumbling stone, resembled the gnarled hand of fate reaching out to claim us. With our hearts pounding like distant drums, we gathered at the imposing front doors. The heavy wooden barrier creaked open with an almost mournful groan, inviting us into a cavernous lobby where darkness stretched out like a bottomless pit. Barely had we crossed the threshold into the forsaken interior when strange, otherworldly sounds began to tear through the silence. At first, we attributed the creaks and groans of the dilapidated building to the natural decay of time. However, as we ventured deeper, the noises grew unnervingly distinct. Whispered voices that seemed too deliberate to be the wind, echoing footsteps that padded softly behind us, and distant, blood-curdling cries that ricocheted off the cold, stone walls. An oppressive tension filled the air, a palpable sense that we were being watched by unseen eyes, as if the hospital itself had come alive to trap us in its malevolent grasp. We tried to rationalize the occurrences as tricks of our imagination, but a dark certainty lingered. Something supernatural was at work here. Intent on capturing every unsettling moment, we set up our equipment in the dilapidated hallways. The longer we recorded, the heavier the atmosphere became. Shadows seemed to twist into sinister figures, taking on shapes that defied explanation. It was as if the building was slowly drawing us into a vortex of impending doom, a nightmare from which there was no waking. The turning point came in what once served as the hospital's infirmary. One of my closest friends, Billy, suddenly stopped in his tracks as a soft, childlike voice began to echo through the room. A plaintive sound that carried both sorrow and menace. The voice, seemingly coming from nowhere, sent a shiver of ice down our spines. We huddled around Billy, trying desperately to pinpoint its source. But with each passing second, the voice grew louder, more insistent, until the terror in Billy's eyes was unmistakable. His gaze glazed over in a vacant horror, and he staggered backward, hands clutching at his throat, before collapsing into a silent heap on the cold, grimy floor. We stood frozen, hearts in our throats, unable to process the stark reality of what had just transpired. In that instant, the ghostly voice ceased, leaving an unbearable silence in its wake, and panic began to seize us. Frantically, we scrambled for an exit, but the hospital seemed to have a will of its own. The corridors, once familiar in our hurried explorations, twisted and shifted before our eyes, an ever-changing labyrinth designed to disorient and ensnare us. In a desperate bid to escape, our friend Tony bolted for the nearest exit. In his haste, he lost his footing and tumbled through a shattered window on the 5th floor. His piercing screams echoed in the void as he fell into the darkness below, a horrifying sound that would forever be etched in our memories. Paralyzed by fear, the rest of us could only huddle together in silence, clinging to the hope that the break of dawn might bring salvation. But as the night wore on, the hospital's malevolence only deepened. With heavy hearts and shattered spirits, we eventually retreated from the building. We had wrapped Tony in a plain white sheet for a proper farewell, but as I glanced back over my shoulder, a chill ran down my spine. The shroud was empty. In sheer disbelief, we combed the area, yet there was no trace of Tony. It was as though the hospital had swallowed him whole, dragging him into a realm beyond our understanding. Determined to unravel the mystery, a few of us dared to return to the foreboding structure in search of answers. The halls seemed endless, drawing us deeper into the decayed heart of the building, past rooms filled with rusted medical equipment and the stench of long-forgotten suffering. Every step felt like a descent into madness, the weight of dread pressing down with each echoing footfall. Then, in a shadowed chamber off a narrow corridor, we encountered a sight that defied belief. There, in a grotesquely twisted posture, lay Billy, no longer the lively young man we knew, but a lifeless figure contorted as if reciting an ancient, cursed incantation. His eyes were dark voids, and in a horrifying display, slithering snakes had wrapped themselves around his motionless body, as though summoned by his final, desperate words. In a moment of unbearable horror, it appeared as if Billy's body convulsed in a fit of unearthly frenzy, drawing the venom of those serpents, while his eyes glowed with a spectral light. Terrified beyond measure, we fled the chamber, yet the presence of Billy seemed to follow us, haunting our every step through the endless maze of the hospital. In the end, we realized with mounting dread that Billy had lured us into a trap. He had unwittingly guided us to the very source of our nightmare. The hospital was not merely an abandoned building. It was a living, malevolent force, determined to torment us with unending fear and despair, ensnaring our souls in its haunted grip. In one final, desperate moment, as we stumbled through a narrow passage, I caught sight of a faded, weathered sign embedded in a crumbling wall. The peeling letters read, "Welcome to the Lone Star Asylum." A shock shot through me, and my mind began to spiral. "This can't be real," I whispered in disbelief. But as I looked around, the horrifying truth became inescapable. We had never truly left the asylum. We remained trapped, forever at the mercy of the sinister, otherworldly forces that roamed its decaying halls. And then, in that overwhelming silence, I heard it again. The dull, foreboding sound of footsteps echoing ominously down a dark corridor. "Damn it, y'all, we're still here," I muttered, as the shadows closed in, and the hospital's ghastly presence sealed our fate. I was never a good sleeper. At 35, restless nights had been my lifelong companion. I wasn't plagued by vivid nightmares. Instead, my nights were filled with endless tossing and turning, with only brief, light moments of sleep that barely allowed me to function the next day, all held together by a bottomless pot of strong Texas coffee. Over the years, I tried every method I could think of, from traditional medical treatments and prescription drugs to alternative remedies suggested by local holistic healers. Growing up in a small West Texas town, I had learned early on to hide my insomnia from everyone, family, friends, co-workers alike. When I finally moved out and rented a modest apartment near Fort Worth, I gradually stopped visiting doctors altogether, relying instead on natural methods that never quite did the trick. A few years back, I turned to soothing media, lo-fi tunes, old Western movies, audiobooks about local legends. My tablet always sat on the nightstand as I attempted to lose myself in its gentle sounds. One night, while scrolling through my usual mix of online curiosities, I discovered a peculiar ASMR video. It wasn't like the others. Its soft, inviting voice was interwoven with eerie, looping footage of abandoned corridors that seemed to stretch on forever. Being an avid seeker of the unexplained, and after countless late-night YouTube rabbit holes about Texan urban legends, I couldn't resist. That rainy autumn evening in Texas, I crawled into bed, tapped play, and watched as a dimly lit, seemingly endless hallway appeared on the screen, accompanied by a slow, melancholy beat. My body began to relax, and before I knew it, the scene shifted unexpectedly into an image of a deserted, retro-style discount store that looked like something straight out of a faded 1980s postcard of America. I never truly dreamed, not in the conventional sense, since my sleep was never deep enough for full-blown dreams. But when I finally opened my eyes, a blinding amber light overwhelmed me. A few disjointed moments later, I wasn't in the comfort of my own bedroom anymore. I found myself sprawled on the cold tile floor of an abandoned retail giant, a relic of a bygone era of American consumerism. The building still bore hints of its former glory, with its vast, echoing aisles and towering shelves loaded with memorabilia, old boxes of Twinkies, vintage Coca-Cola bottles, and packets of Doritos, all bathed in a soft, diffused glow. From hidden speakers, a crackling, nostalgic tune played. A tune that, despite its cheerful melody, was underscored by an unsettling silence that made my blood run cold. I sat up slowly, questioning whether I was in a dream, one that I'd never experienced before despite all the nights spent in light slumber. This forsaken store was far larger than I'd ever imagined. Countless aisles branched out in every direction, and in the distance I could barely discern the outlines of dusty old windows, a hint of the outside world. I decided to move toward them, hoping desperately to find an exit from this surreal labyrinth. Am I really dreaming? I kept asking myself. The music, though strange, was crystal clear, and the chill in the air felt all too real. I half expected the front doors to suddenly swing open, rescuing me from this waking nightmare. But the further I walked, the longer the corridors stretched, and soon the labels on the shelves blurred into indecipherable smudges until they meant nothing at all. I can't say how long I wandered. Those front windows seemed to recede into infinity. At last, I stopped, a crushing dread seizing me as I tried to force myself awake. In a trembling voice, I shouted, "Wake up!" Yet there was no answer, only an eerie, momentary silence. Then, without warning, the music died, and a calm, almost unnervingly neutral, male voice broke through the quiet over the store's PA system. "Attention shoppers, the store is now closed. Please make your way to the nearest exit." The announcement repeated a few times, and just as I called out again, desperate for someone, anyone, to acknowledge my presence, the lights began to flicker and die, one aisle after another. Dark shadows slithered across what had once been bright, welcoming corridors until the entire store was submerged in a feeble, yellow glow. Doubt gnawed at me. What if this wasn't a dream at all? There was something profoundly unsettling in the air, something that defied all logic. With no other option, I pressed forward. Suddenly, at the end of a narrow aisle, I spotted a figure. Who could it be? Perhaps a friendly cashier from a long-closed discount store, or maybe someone I once knew from back home. I strained my eyes in the darkness, expecting to see a familiar, comforting face, but instead, a gaunt, spectral silhouette emerged, its form unnaturally thin, missing every recognizable human feature. A sickening dread clenched my stomach. The figure stood there, a shapeless mass of impenetrable black, swallowing the faint beams of light without a trace of eyes or any hint of humanity. "Come on, wake up already," I silently begged. I had only been seeking a few hours of peaceful sleep, yet this nightmare was beyond anything I had ever imagined. Slowly, I began to backtrack down the aisle, never daring to lose sight of that horrifying shape. Around me, towering shelves packed with nostalgic snack wrappers and remnants of a bygone era of American retail closed in. Until suddenly, the dark figure took a deliberate, resounding step. A heavy thud that shattered the eerie calm of the abandoned store. "Attention shoppers, the store is now closed. Attention shoppers, the store is now closed." The mechanical, almost robotic tone echoed in my ears, only to abruptly shift into a jarring alarm that threatened to strip me of my hearing. In that heart-stopping moment, the dark figure surged forward, its footsteps pounding on the worn, cracked tiles as it advanced relentlessly. I turned and ran, bolting down the seemingly endless aisle, with shelves looming like insurmountable walls on either side. Behind me, I could only hear rapid, echoing steps, devoid of any sound of breath or protest. One desperate thought cut through my terror. Dream or reality, I had to run, hoping desperately to wake up before this spectral presence caught me. With trembling hands, I hurled bags of snacks to the floor, praying that the scattered debris might slow down my pursuer. But each bag burst in a series of small, crackling explosions as the creature stomped over the remnants without a hint of pause. I wasn't built for sprints. This narrow corridor offered no escape route, and the dark figure closed in inexorably. Every step felt like a marathon fueled by pure terror. Sweat streamed down my face, my legs burned like hot coals, and the icy grip of despair took hold of my mind. All I could think was, run until this nightmare ended, before I was lost to this shadow forever. Then my legs betrayed me. With squeaking shoes echoing on the cold, unyielding tiles, I felt my body collapse. In one final, frantic act, I lunged for a nearby shelf stacked with dusty snack boxes. Uncertain whether it might break my fall or serve as a desperate shield against the encroaching darkness, suddenly, I gasped as I was violently yanked back into my bed. It wasn't as if I had abruptly sat up. Rather, it felt as though I'd been thrown off a cliff directly onto my mattress. Dazed and disoriented, I sat up with my heart hammering in my chest, wiping clammy hands over a face still slick with sweat. I was in my modest Fort Worth apartment. Oddly, I wasn't in my usual flannel pajamas, but in jeans and a t-shirt that still bore the damp residue of my frantic escape. My tablet on the nightstand was dark. Had it all been nothing more than a nightmare? A dream so vivid it seemed real enough to haunt me? I exhaled a shaky sigh of relief, but barely had I settled back down when I heard a soft rustling, like the crinkling of an old bag of Lay's chips. Panic surged through me as I jumped from the bed and discovered scattered, crushed snack wrappers, their faded logos and grainy prints reminiscent of an old-school video game. Since that fateful, rain-soaked evening, my sleep has never been the same. And even now, in the dead silence of Texan nights, when shadows dance in the corners of my memory, I still wonder, was it merely a dream? Or did the ghostly presence of that abandoned discount store really come to life in the heart of Texas? In the dense woods near the small rural town of Coyote Springs, Texas, runs a swift creek known to locals as Devil's Fork. For over 80 years, a chilling phenomenon has been witnessed along its banks. A spectral presence that has become woven into the very fabric of local lore. Townsfolk whisper in hushed tones about the drowned girl, a name born out of equal measures of fear and reverence by generations of Texans who claim to have seen her. They say the ghost is that of a young girl who met a mysterious fate on the banks of Devil's Fork. Despite the passing years, her appearance remains unnervingly unchanged, as if she had died only yesterday. Witnesses describe her in striking detail, a cascade of fiery red hair that now shimmers with hints of earthy brown under the relentless Texas sun, and hazel eyes that glint almost green when the light catches them just right. She is forever clad in a grimy white dress, its hem long frayed by time, and curiously, she's seen with only one battered boot, the other, pale and shoeless, dangling limply in the water. Whenever the local sheriff or a team of Texas Rangers arrives to investigate reports matching her description, she vanishes into thin air, as if dissolving into the humid, stifling atmosphere of a long, sweltering summer night. Some even claim that in the brief moment someone dares to look, her lips twitch ever so slightly, as though in silent acknowledgement, leaving behind an eerie reminder that perhaps her existence is no mere fabrication. The Coyote Springs Police Department is well acquainted with the legend of Devil's Fork. Over decades, numerous patrols have been dispatched whenever tips arose about a body matching the ghostly description. Yet each time, the mysterious figure would vanish before anyone could get close. Some locals dismiss the tale as a product of overactive imaginations in a town too prone to tall tales, while others insist that the consistency of her appearances defies rational explanation. The legend took a darker, more desperate turn one blistering summer when a band of rebellious teenagers, driven by equal parts fear and daredevil curiosity, decided to test the rumors for themselves. My older cousin, Wyatt, surrounded by a rough-and-ready crew of friends from the local high school, led the audacious ritual on a humid late afternoon. I was there too, though still too young to grasp the full weight of what was about to unfold. Wyatt strode up to the edge of Devil's Fork and, with a mix of bravado and trembling determination, seized the ghostly figure's arm as she appeared before us in her usual spot. Without a second thought, he dragged her deeper into the churning water. He pressed her head beneath the icy, muddy current for what felt like an eternity. Even though she had long since been beyond life, it was impossible to tell whether she ever truly submitted to his will. After a couple of minutes, Wyatt hauled her back to the spot where she always reposed and leaned in close, murmuring his desperate request. All he wanted was money, maybe even a new pickup truck, to replace his old, barely running rig that had seen better days. For a hot-headed teenager in a small Texas town, such a wish seemed worth every risk. Then, without warning, Wyatt froze as if he'd heard some ghostly whisper carried on the humid air. None of us could make out a single word, but later, some of the other kids swore they saw the spectral girl's lips quiver, though we were too far away to discern what might have been said. Moments later, Wyatt's face twisted into an eerie grin, more reminiscent of a wild animal than of any expression of satisfaction. "Wyatt?" I asked in a trembling voice. "What's happening?" "Nothing," he snapped back. laughing harshly in a tone that sent shivers down our spines. Nothing. She's going to give me exactly what I asked for. In the days that followed, several other local youngsters ventured to Devil's Fork to attempt their own rituals, convinced that the ghostly girl held a cursed power capable of granting their most desperate wishes. I, however, kept my distance as those ominous nights passed. In our tight-knit community, rumors spread like wildfire, and soon every hushed conversation spoke of the unholy pact made that fateful afternoon. Wyatt, meanwhile, seemed to be floating on a cloud of reckless ecstasy, as though his wish had already been fulfilled. He began hosting wild parties in the basement of an old, abandoned barn on the outskirts of town. Sneaking bottles of whiskey from his father's hidden stash, he carried himself as though nothing had disturbed the natural order of things. That is, until Uncle Jesse, an old-school Texan with a deep respect for law and order, delivered a stern talking to one humid evening, leaving Wyatt visibly rattled. For us kids, it had all felt like a daring step toward adulthood, though now I realize it was the harbinger of something far more sinister. Roughly 2 weeks after that ill-fated ritual, I noticed a disturbing change in Wyatt. One cool evening, I found him slumped in an old rocking chair on the porch, staring out into the dark woods that bordered Devil's Fork. He looked gaunt, his skin stretched tight like the surface of a worn leather boot, and his eyes bore the mark of a wild, almost animalistic desperation that made my heart pound in terror. When I timidly reached out to him, he recoiled as if I'd touched something unholy. "What's wrong with you?" I asked softly. "Ever since that night, you've been acting crazy." "Crazy?" he retorted sharply. "You don't know a damn thing." Yet behind those words lay a palpable despair, his eyes flickering away from mine as if ashamed of a secret too dark to speak of. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he murmured, "What I asked for is coming tomorrow." His face broke into an unsettling smile, while his hands trembled violently in the dim light of the porch lamp. Fear and confusion drove me to withdraw into myself, unable to fathom his cryptic warning. I never spoke of that night with anyone. The ritual was to remain a guarded secret, far from the prying eyes of our elders who'd sooner shut us out at the mere mention of Devil's Fork. But the next morning, Uncle Jesse knocked on our door, his face grim as he explained that Wyatt had vanished in the dead of night. He'd slipped out the back after everyone in the house had long since fallen asleep, leaving us with a foreboding sense that something terrible was on the horizon. That very afternoon, as my father drove me through a tangle of amber-hued, rustling pines, we came upon a shocking scene at the bank of Devil's Fork. A somber crowd of young and old had gathered, their expressions etched with a mix of sorrow and disbelief. For a brief moment, I caught sight of Aunt Sarah and Uncle Jesse embracing tightly before my father pulled me aside. "You're not meant to see this," he commanded firmly. Unable to resist, I slipped away and peered over the creek's edge, and what I saw made the blood in my veins run ice cold. Instead of the solitary, spectral figure we'd all come to dread, the water was now choked with the bodies of several teenagers, drifting listlessly among the jagged rocks. There, among them, lay Wyatt, his once bright eyes now empty and soulless. At the center of the grim tableau, the drowned girl floated, her thin, pallid lips curved into a mocking smile, as if she were amused by the tragic consequences of our reckless dare. While the authorities eventually hauled away the lifeless bodies, the ghost remained, unmoved, untouched, as though she had deliberately chosen to linger and watch over the unfolding calamity. The local sheriff's department soon cordoned off the area and posted stern warnings along the winding country roads leading into the woods. Yet, even now, curious children and thrill seekers manage to sneak into those haunted forests, hoping to catch a glimpse of the spectral girl whose legend refuses to fade. What exactly the drowned girl commanded that fateful night remains a mystery I will likely never unravel. Some say she ordered the teenagers to plunge themselves into the murky water in a fit of vengeful spite. Others whisper that in their desperate bid for the ultimate thrill, they inadvertently sealed their own fate, begging for an escape from lives filled with hardship. I can't help but believe that, for the first time since her untimely demise, the ghostly figure rose up to drag each of those young souls down into the inky depths of Devil's Fork with her own spectral hands. Whether that truly happened is a secret that lingers in the dark shadows of our beloved Texas Creek, a secret I dare not confront by meeting her unblinking eyes. And so, the legend of the drowned girl endures, a grim reminder of a pact with forces beyond our understanding, etched indelibly into the lore of Coyote Springs and the wild, unforgiving heart of Texas.